How does the man who, wrote the foundational math for the fabric of reality and literally inspired the discovery of DNA, how does he also end up as a documented serial predator whose own university stripped his name from their buildings?
It's really the ultimate historical dissonance. I mean, we prefer our scientific pioneers to be neat and rational and easily categorized, right? But reality rarely obliges.
Yeah, no kidding. Welcome to today's deep dive. We've gathered a stack of sources for you today, mostly centering on a comprehensive biographical overview of the Austrian-Irish physicist Erwin Schrödinger.
Right, and that draws heavily on Walter Moore's definitive biography, along with various historical records.
Exactly. And our mission today isn't just to, recite a textbook timeline. We really want to go far beyond that famous pop culture cat thought experiment that you see printed on coffee mugs everywhere.
Yeah, the cat meme.
Right. We're going to explore the brilliant, incredibly diverse, and frankly deeply disturbing reality of the man who helped invent modern physics.
Because Schrödinger is a name almost everyone recognizes, but very few people actually understand what he did, let alone who he was.
Right.
At a high level, we are talking about a scientist who won the 1933 Nobel Prize in Physics for his wave equation. But his intellectual reach didn't stop there at all.
No, it went way further.
He dove into the theoretical origins of biology and deeply into ancient Eastern mysticism. Yet, alongside that towering, epic-defining intellect, his personal life hid a really dark, documented legacy of abuse.
So we're going to unpack all of it.
Yeah.
Let's start with the science that made him immortal, because there is this incredible irony baked right into his greatest achievement.
Oh, absolutely.
Schrödinger absolutely hated the implications of his own discovery.
He really did. I mean, to understand why, we have to look at the physics landscape in 1926. Schrödinger publishes a paper introducing what he called wave mechanics.
And at the center of that is the Schrödinger equation.
Exactly. Before this, classical physics treated the world like billiard balls. If you know a ball's speed and trajectory, you know exactly where it's going to end up.
Right, it's predictable.
But in the quantum realm, the microscopic world of atoms, particles just don't behave like predictable billiard balls.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is this equation doing if it's not tracking a physical ball?
So it tracks a wave function. The equation basically calculates how the quantum state of a physical system changes dynamically over time.
Okay.
And initially, Schrödinger himself thought this wave function described a physical reality. He pictured an electron not as a tiny dot, but physically smeared out through space, like this continuous, elegant wave of jelly moving around the nucleus.
He wanted a physical reality he could actually picture in his head. Think of Schrödinger's vision of wave mechanics like a smooth, continuous symphony. It's elegant, it flows, it feels intuitive.
Yes, that's exactly how he saw it.
But then you have this rival interpretation pushing back against him. You had Werner Heisenberg developing his own mathematical version of quantum mechanics, which was called matrix mechanics.
Right.
And if Schrödinger's theory was a flowing symphony, Heisenberg's matrix mechanics was like jarring, discrete, digital blips. I mean, it wasn't about smooth waves. It was about quantized, unpredictable leaps of energy that you couldn't easily visualize.
That is a really highly accurate way to contrast them. Heisenberg's math was purely about what you could measure the discrete inputs and outputs without trying to picture the invisible machinery in between.
And Schrödinger hated that.
He despised it. He actually complained to his students, and this is a documented quote, he said, "Now the damned Göttingen physicists," referring to Heisenberg's camp, "use my beautiful wave mechanics for calculating their shitty matrix elements."
Wow, he's incredibly bitter.
Oh, yeah.
You give them a beautiful symphony, and they chop it up into data points.
And it gets worse for him. A physicist named Max Born comes along and proves that Schrödinger's wave isn't a physical smear of matter at all. It's a wave of probability.
A wave of probability.
Yeah, it just describes the likelihood of finding a particle in a given spot.
So the universe at its most fundamental level is literally just rolling dice.
Precisely. And this becomes the prevailing view, championed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, which we now call the famous Copenhagen interpretation.
Right.
It stated that the quantum world is inherently probabilistic. A particle exists in a superposition, so a cloud of multiple possibilities, and it doesn't settle into a definite state until it is observed or measured.
And Schrödinger hated the idea that nature, at its core, was just a game of chance.
Right. He famously said of this probability interpretation, "I don't like it, and I'm sorry I ever had anything to do with it."
Which completely changes the context of his most famous contribution to pop culture. I mean, I always thought Schrödinger's cat was him saying, look how cool and weird quantum physics is.
What's fascinating here is that it's the exact opposite. He proposed the cat thought experiment in 1935 after writing back and forth with Albert Einstein as a sarcastic joke.
Really? A joke.
Yeah. It was meant to ridicule Bohr and Heisenberg and demonstrate how absurd their logic was.
Walk us through his logic, for those who might just know the meme.
So he essentially said, okay, let's apply your Copenhagen logic to the macroscopic, everyday world. I put a cat in a sealed steel chamber. Next to it, I place a radioactive atom that has a 50-50 chance of decaying in the next hour.
Okay, so it's a coin flip.
Right. If it decays, it triggers a hammer that smashes a vial of poison gas, killing the cat. If it doesn't decay, the cat lives. According to Bohr and Heisenberg, until you open the box to observe the atom, it exists in a superposition. It has both decayed and not decayed.
So therefore, the poison is both released and not released.
Exactly. And the cat is simultaneously dead and alive until you open the box and force reality to pick a state. Schrödinger thought this was utterly ridiculous.
He's basically calling them out.
Yes. He believed this proved that the probabilistic interpretation was fundamentally flawed and incomplete because, it led to absurdities once scaled up.
That is wild. The ultimate science meme started as a sarcastic burn against his colleagues.
Yeah.
But the tragedy for him is that his colleagues were largely right. The universe really is that weird. And because he was so thoroughly disgusted by the chaotic, probabilistic universe his own math had uncovered, he decides he can't stay in that lane.
Right.
He shifts his focus entirely, desperately searching for order and unity somewhere else.
He starts looking for a domain that makes sense. And to understand how he makes this shift, you really have to look at the historical timeline. By 1938, Schrödinger had fled the Nazi annexation of Austria.
Right.
He had actually already left Germany back in 1933 in firm opposition to their anti-Semitism. He bounces around Europe facing harassment until 1939. And then he receives a personal invitation from Eamon de Valera, Ireland's Tu Siege, to move to Dublin and direct the School of Theoretical Physics.
So he lands in Dublin, and he's safe from the war. And in 1944, he writes a book called What is Life? He starts looking at the phenomenon of biology strictly from the point of view of physics.
Yes, he's asking a profound question. How does a living organism avoid decaying into chaos? Which leads to this concept he calls negentropy.
Negentropy. Okay, so to grasp negentropy, we have to remember the second law of thermodynamics.
Right.
It basically states that everything in the universe is constantly moving toward maximum entropy, meaning maximum disorder and chaos. A hot cup of coffee cools down, an iron gate rusts, left alone, everything falls apart.
But living things don't. A tree grows from a seed into a highly organized structure. You and I maintain complex, organized bodies for decades. So how do we beat this second law of thermodynamics?
That's the big question.
Schrödinger argued that life sustains itself by essentially extracting order from its environment. You eat food, which is highly ordered matter, you break it down for energy, and you excrete chaotic, disordered waste and heat. So by feeding on order, life generates negative entropy, or negentropy. It's like a localized rebellion against the chaos of the universe.
Okay, that makes sense. But he goes even further, right? Because to maintain that rebellion across generations, life needs an instruction manual.
Yes, and this is where his background in quantum mechanics proves crucial. He theorized that the genetic code for living organisms must be stored physically in a microscopic structure.
Some kind of molecular code.
Right, but the structure had to be extremely stable to survive for generations, yet complex enough to hold vast amounts of information. So he proposed what he called an aperiodic crystal.
Wait, an aperiodic crystal. Need some help visualizing that. When I hear crystal, I think of like a diamond or a grain of salt.
Think of a regular crystal like salt. It is highly ordered, but it's dumb. It's just a pattern of sodium and chlorine atoms repeating endlessly.
Like a floor covered in identical white tiles. It's orderly, but you can't exactly use it to write down a recipe.
Exactly. But an aperiodic crystal is a structure that is highly organized, incredibly stable, but it doesn't strictly repeat.
So that's more like a mosaic made of thousands of different colored tiles. Because the pattern changes, you can actually use it to spell out words or code.
Precisely. He argued that the chromosomes inside cells must be giant aperiodic crystals holding a chemical code that dictates how the organism grows. And keep in mind, he published this in 1944.
Years before anyone actually knew what DNA looked like.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This physicist, taking a break from quantum mechanics to write a speculative side project book about biology, literally inspires the discovery of DNA.
It's amazing.
Both James D. Watson and Francis Crick, the scientists credited with discovering the double helix structure in 1953, specifically cited Schrödinger's What is Life as their inspiration. He reframed biology from this mysterious vital force into a physical problem of molecular information storage.
It just demonstrates what an incredible synthesizer he was. But his search for underlying unity went even deeper than biology. His deep dive into life brought him right back to the philosophical nightmares of quantum mechanics.
Specifically the role of the observer.
Right. If the Copenhagen interpretation is true, and a wave function only collapses into reality when it's observed well, that implies the observer plays a fundamental role in creating reality.
And Schrödinger wrote that if the world is created by our act of observation, there should be billions of worlds, one for each conscious being on Earth. But our worlds synchronize. I see the same table that you see. Why?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it leads directly into his deep immersion in Arthur Schopenhauer and ancient Indian philosophy. Schrödinger found his answer in the Upanishads and Advaita Vedanta.
He adopted this one-mind philosophy.
Yes, he argued that consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, and that the multiplicity of minds is just an illusion.
Wait, an illusion?
Yes, he believed that in truth there is only one mind, one singular consciousness in the universe, and every living thing is just a different aperture, a different window through which that one mind experiences the world.
He even expressed deep sympathy for the Eastern idea of tatvamasi, that you can throw yourself on the ground with a certain conviction that you are one with Mother Earth and she is one with you.
Right, and he used this philosophy to solve his physics problem. If there is only one consciousness experiencing the universe through billions of eyes, then there is no conflict. The universe synchronizes because there's ultimately only one observer.
It sounds beautiful. I mean, this ultimate grand unification of physics, biology, and spirit. It's the kind of legacy you want to put on a pedestal.
You do.
But there's a massive jarring fracture here. Because when you look at how he actually lived, how he treated the other windows of that supposedly unified consciousness, the reality is chaotic and profoundly abusive.
We have to look at the documented history here exactly as it's presented in our source materials. And this draws primarily from Walter Moore's extensive 1989 biography, as well as subsequent historical research.
The facts are just. They present a stark contradiction to his philosophy of universal empathy.
Very stark.
Let's look at his unconventional domestic arrangements. When he immigrated to Ireland in 1938, he obtained visas for himself, his wife Annie, and a woman named Hilda March.
Right.
Hild was the wife of an Austrian colleague, and Schrödinger had already fathered a child with her. They lived in a ménage à trois in Dublin. And this wasn't even a new development. Earlier in his career, his insistence on setting up house with both his wife and his mistresses created scandals that cost him permanent positions at both Oxford and Princeton.
But, the societal rejection of his living arrangements in the 1930s is one thing. The allegations detailed in Moore's biography are far more severe.
Yeah.
Moore explicitly describes Schrödinger as having a Lolita complex, and recent articles, including pieces in the Irish Times, have analyzed this history, denouncing him as a serial abuser with a predilection for teenage girls.
I'm really struggling to reconcile this. You have a man writing profound books about the unity of all life while engaging in predatory behavior. We need to be clear about the timeline the sources provide. Let's go back to 1926. This is the exact same year he publishes his revolutionary wave equation, cementing his place in history. Schrödinger is 39 years old. He begins tutoring a 14-year-old girl named Itty Younger.
And according to the biography, those tutoring lessons involved what was described as a fair amount of petting and cuddling, and he documented falling in love with his young pupil.
Wow.
The timeline progresses from there. Not long after her 17th birthday, they became lovers.
And it gets darker. In 1932, when Ithy was 20, she became pregnant. Moore's biography states that Schrödinger tried to persuade her to have the child, offering to take care of it, but absolutely refusing to divorce his wife.
Right.
In desperation, Ithy arranged for a dangerous illegal abortion. It is deeply uncomfortable to read. How does a biographer even explain that level of cognitive dissonance?
This raises an important question, right? The sources, particularly Carlo Rovelli's book Helgoland, note that Schrödinger made no secret of his fascination with pre-adolescent girls. The Moore biography actually quotes Schrödinger's own diary, where he attempts to justify his actions.
He tried to justify it.
Yes, he uses an incredibly arrogant, male supremacist logic, basically stating that men of strong intellect are naturally only attracted to women who are at the very beginning of their intellectual development.
So he used his towering intellect to rationalize his predatory behavior.
That's what the diary suggests.
And E.T. Younger wasn't an isolated incident. He fathered multiple children with different women, constantly juggling affairs. The biography details an episode in Ireland where he became infatuated with a 12-year-old girl.
A 12-year-old?
Yes. The sources say he only desisted after someone had a serious word with him, but he later disgustingly kept her on a list of his life's unrequited loves.
This really raises an important question about how institutions handle the legacies of historical figures when this kind of documented evidence, drawn largely from their own diaries and comprehensive historical research, comes to light.
Right.
We are seeing modern institutions actively having to respond to this reality.
Trinity College, Dublin is the prime example, right?
Yeah.
That's where he gave his famous What is Life lectures.
Yes. In January 2022, the physics department at Trinity College Dublin announced they were dropping his name from a physics lecture theater that had borne his name since the 1990s.
And they also removed his portrait from the building, didn't they?
They did.
They made a statement emphasizing that while they continued to acknowledge his indisputable foundational contributions to science, they cannot ignore the disturbing, documented information about his abusive behavior.
It is about separating the mathematical utility of the Schrödinger equation from the veneration of the man himself. By simply reporting the timeline of his actions, we recognize the profound documented harm he caused to vulnerable young women without needing to, inject modern political framing.
Right.
The facts of his life really stand on their own.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? For decades, the narrative of science has been built around the great man theory. We name equations after them. We put their faces on monuments. Schrödinger was literally on the Austrian 1,000-shilling banknote for years.
Yeah, he was a national hero.
It just completely shatters the illusion of the pristine, logical scientist. The whiplash is staggering.
It demonstrates that extraordinary intellectual capability in grasping the physical universe does not inherently come with moral fortitude in navigating the human one.
No, clearly not.
He believed his scientific work was an intellectual approach to divinity, a way to uncover the ultimate unity of nature. Yet his earthly actions were incredibly selfish and destructive.
Which brings us to the close of today's deep dive. We've traveled from the invisible probability waves of quantum mechanics through the intricate molecular structures of DNA into the ancient texts of Indian philosophy, and finally, down into the darkest, most abusive corners of a celebrated scientist's life.
Quite a journey.
I think this really challenges what it means for us to be well-informed. True knowledge isn't just about memorizing a wave equation or laughing at a paradox about a cat in a box. It's about holding the tension of these complex, flawed, and sometimes terrible human realities and refusing to look away from the ugly parts just because the math is beautiful.
And there's one final detail from the source material that perfectly encapsulates that tension, something for you to mull over as we finish. When Schrödinger died of tuberculosis in 1961, he was buried in Austria.
Okay.
Above his nameplate on the grave marker, his famous quantum mechanical wave equation is inscribed on a circular plaque.
The ultimate permanent symbol of his intellectual legacy.
Exactly. But remember earlier when we discussed how his belief in the one mind bled back into his physics?
Right, the Eastern philosophy intersecting with his math.
Because he believed all alternatives in a quantum superposition aren't just probabilities, but things that happen simultaneously, he actually anticipated the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics decades before it became popular.
Really?
Yeah. He saw the wave function as something physically real, representing branching, simultaneous realities.
Wait, the theory that every single time a quantum choice is made, the universe splits.
Yes. So, if the many worlds interpretation he hinted at is true, that every choice, every observation spawns a new, parallel reality, is there a universe out there somewhere where Schrödinger the man actually lived up to the beautiful, unified morality of his philosophy?
Oh, wow.
A universe where he chose empathy, rather than succumbing to the dark, abusive impulses he chose to act on in our reality.
Well, think about that the next time you hear someone mention Schrödinger's cat. Is the good version of him in the box or the monster? Until next time, keep digging deeper.